Good morning. There have been times in my life when I have had to live with the consequences of my own poor choices. I know that I have completely blown it, and I fear that I am of no use whatsoever to God. Have you ever felt this way? I am an historian. I studied history at university, and I enjoy studying history even now. But isn't it interesting that the facts of history never change, but the way that we see those facts often does? Yesterday, we were erecting statues to men that we saw as heroes, and today we are vilifying those men and pulling down the statues. There are stories from history that we really hate to hear. But history is not for us to like or dislike. It's there for us to learn from. Sometimes what we learn about history is offensive, and that's not a bad thing, because we learn from other people's mistakes. We are less likely to repeat those mistakes that we find offensive. But we can't erase the past by just saying that it didn't happen. We need to acknowledge it and then move forward. I think that this is one of the great messages of the Bible. After all, it's not a book about perfect people. It is, in fact, the story of a people who continually mess up and who are still forgiven by a loving God. The Bible's not a story about a bunch of saints. Rather, it's a pretty compelling compilation of stories about people who, just like you and me, struggled, who stumbled, who failed, who gave up, and who just simply messed up. But haven't you found in life that it's not the successes from which you learn your greatest lessons? It's the failures. God teaches us the greatest lessons of our lives in our mistakes and the mistakes of others. It's through mistakes, in fact, that God makes his plan known to us. It makes his will evident, and it's through our mistakes that the power of God's mercy, God's forgiveness, and God's grace becomes evident. Let's begin with Moses. When he was 40 years old, Moses became overcome with anger when he discovered that an Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew slave. Moses actually murdered the Egyptian and left his body buried in the sand. And instead of facing up to the consequences of what he had done, he fled to a distant land and started a new life. Later, many years later, when Moses was a very old man, God called to him to lead 2 million Jews out of Egypt, to deliver the 10 Commandments to his people, and eventually to take them back to the Promised Land. Have you ever heard of the prophet Elijah? He had so many miraculous events happen in his life that you would think that he would have an absolutely unshakable faith. But not so. When Jezebel vowed to see him dead, and Elijah's face-off with the Baal worshippers made the king mad, Elijah simply couldn't face it anymore. He packed up his bags and ran away and hid in the wilderness. But after a time, God spoke to Elijah and sent him back into the fray. Or how about King David, one of the most revered of the Old Testament kings? David was called a man after God's own heart. But David still broke most of the commandments. He coveted his neighbor's wife. He committed adultery, he lied, and he even committed murder. But still, God used David as a leader for his people. And even today, we quote David regularly and sing the songs that he wrote. Who can forget the awe-inspiring story of Jonah and the whale? Do you remember that it happened because God asked Jonah to do something and Jonah refused to do it? And then he ran away and hid from God. But as you know, there is no hiding from God, and Jonah found that out. So Jonah was swallowed by a whale and sat in the whale's belly until he repented and agreed to do what God had asked of him. Have you ever heard of Tamar? She left her family at a very young age to marry into the family of Judah. In those days, a woman's worth was determined by her offspring, but Tamar did not conceive with her first husband, so God struck him down, and she was married to his brother. The brother didn't really want to have a child with Tamar, and so God struck him down, and she was married to yet a third brother. Faced with a very real threat of being childless, homeless, and destitute, Tamar dressed as a prostitute and coerced her father-in-law to have sex with her, and she conceived and bore twins. Tamar is one of the few women mentioned in the lineage of Jesus because one of those twins was actually an ancestor of David the king. Now, you probably all know the story that we usually tell on Good Friday of how the apostle Simon Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times, even though Jesus had told him that it was about to happen. Peter failed Jesus in the most crucial moment in all of human history, but even so, Peter became the rock on which the Christian church was built. Let me just remind you of probably the most gigantic of all the biblical failures, the Apostle Paul. Because before he was Paul, he was Saul, a ruthless crusader bent on preventing the growth of Christianity by throwing Christians in prison, by destroying churches, and even by murdering members of the New Young sect. But Saul wanted to eradicate Christianity completely because he saw it as a threat to his Jewish faith. And then one day, God spoke to Saul on the road to Damascus, and he was transformed forever. He became Paul the apostle, the crusader for Christ. He dedicated the rest of his life into spreading the message of Christ's gift of salvation for the world, because God didn't just forgive Paul, he used him for the building of the kingdom. You see, the worst people in all of human history were still a part of God's plan. The worst messes in humanity were still able to demonstrate for the world the incredible love, mercy, and grace of God. Because God is great. People, not so much. People fail. People mess up. And people fear the wrath of God. But if I have not learned anything else about God in my life, I have learned this. God is all about redemption. God is all about giving us a chance for that great comeback story. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them." Be confident in this. No matter what you have done in the past to offend God, the adventure isn't over yet. God is already at work reclaiming you, giving your story a great new outcome. Failure isn't a sign that you are a failure. Failure just means that you have to try something else, that the particular path that you're on is not the one that God had in mind for you. Or maybe, just maybe, you needed to fail so that others could use that failure to learn about something, to see that failure is not the worst thing in the world. Not trying is probably the worst thing in the world. Not trying doesn't just let you down. Not trying lets God and all of his people down. When you see the statues to people that we now know were failures, people who broke the world's laws and God's laws, don't be inspired to tear them down. Be inspired to learn a lesson that their lives were meant to teach. Because your story is still being written. We serve a God who is able to take our defeats and our missteps and our failures and use them to bring glory and honor to his name. Thanks to Mrs. Davis for joining me again. It's great to be back working together as a team. Let's all pray. Oh Lord our God, we look around you and see that you accomplish great things with flawed and broken vessels. We are in awe. We are so glad to be of use to you in this world, to help you in any way in your plan for our salvation and for the coming of the kingdom. We ask that you will bless each one of your children with grace today, that we may all live our very best lives and be all that you would have us be. Amen.